To start this video, I want to ask everyone a question, all right? A personal question. And there's a poll in the description. It's poll number 1 in the description. I want you to click on it and answer the question, all right? I want you to tell me how your morale has been over the course of your life, or rather the direction of your morale. Has it increased, decreased, or stayed about the same? When you're done with that, come back to the video and we'll continue. Now, if your answer to that question was that your morale has been decreasing, I need you to watch this video. And to everyone else, I still need you to watch this video. All of you need you to watch this video. What if I told you your entire perception of reality was wrong? Okay, now, you'd probably call me crazy, right? You think, oh, this is just another self-help guru who is just trying to make a quick buck, trying to get by in life. But what would it take for me to convince you that your perception was wrong? It would take extraordinary evidence, right? Extraordinary evidence. Okay, well, I'm going to give that evidence to you today. But in order to do that, you're going to have to follow me, and I'm going to make some assumptions, and you're going to have to assume that my assumptions are correct. Now, what am I saying to you? Well, I'm almost telling you to believe what I'm saying blindly without questioning it, right? Well, that sounds like a cult, right? Makes sense. It sounds like every religion that's ever existed, right? They try to control thought in order to control people. So if you happen to be a religious person, your perception is in part controlled by that religion. And in order for you to understand this, I'm going to need you to imagine that your perception of God is wrong, that your religion is wrong, okay? And if you don't do this, then you might as well not watch the rest of the video, because you're going to have a very hard time understanding these concepts. But if you aren't religious and you do consider yourself a spiritual person, it's going to be this message is going to be a lot easier to get across. And it's because you are still open to you're still looking for an interpretation. You're confused, right? You don't really know why there's so much pain in the world, but you look at these religions and you see them and you think, well, this certainly isn't the answer, right? Because these religions are causing all this pain, aren't they? Well, I'm also going to dissolve that perception, okay? Today, I'm going to prove to you that every major religion that exists in the world today began worshiping the same exact thing, okay? Now, they weren't worshiping a god per se, but they were worshiping the same thing. And in effect, I'm going to prove every major religion right and wrong. Now, it might seem like a logical contradiction, okay? Fair enough. I need you to dissolve your perception and go on this journey with me, all right? Now, let's begin. So, when we start thinking about this, when I start making assumptions, we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start with our perception, okay? A perception of what reality is. That is reality, right? It's the way we perceive the way we are existing in this universe. So let's take reality, and again, we're equating reality to perception. So let's try to break this down into categories. What goes into your reality? What goes into your perception? What builds it from the day you're born? Well, I think it's easiest to divide this into 2 categories, okay? We have natural factors and unnatural factors, right? The natural factors, by definition, are the things which are out of the scope of human control, right? And the unnatural factors are the things that are within our control, right? So we can say that in order to best control our perception, we have to take hold of these unnatural factors, right? We can't control the natural ones, but if we can control the unnatural, we enhance our ability to control the natural, right? So how does humanity control these unnatural factors? What goes into these? Well, what goes into the portion of perception which we create? Well, everything that we teach each other and everything that we learn from each other, right? So in effect, you could say that the way we communicate with each other creates that portion of perception which we control. Now, I've tried to remain perfectly logical thus far. I've tried to keep all the logic perfectly valid, and even if you have a confliction with something I've said so far, again, I need you to assume that I'm right. So let's consider perception again and think about how we actually perceive things. What is the medium with which the reality is described to us? Well, we have senses, right? We have the sense of touch, sense of sight, hearing, the olfactory senses, taste and smell, the five senses. So let's take each of these separately and break them down farther. Now, the goal here is to come up with an exhaustive list of all the ways that we describe our sense of touch. So we'll start, all right? We can sense the hardness of an object, all right? The magnitude to which an object is soft or hard, right? We can detect the roughness or smoothness of an object, the magnitude of roughness or smoothness, right? The magnitude of heat or cold, the magnitude of wet or dryness, all right? The magnitude of dullness or sharpness. And one more that might be kind of hard to pick up on is the dichotomy between an itch and a tickle. So if something itches, you have to scratch it. But if something tickles, it's effectively a scratch that is tickling you. So you want to remove the contact. Now, there's one more, and I'm just going to write it out, okay? It's the magnitude of pain or pleasure, right? Okay, but let's put this aside. Let's move on to hearing, okay? How does our mind segment the things we hear, the auditory stimuli that go into our brain? Well, for some reason, and we don't really know why, but our brain divides an octave into 12 half steps, okay? If we take an octave and divide it into 13 half steps or 11 half steps, it just sounds off to us. It's for some reason our brains don't identify with it. But what they do happen to identify with particularly well is 7-note scales in an octave. So we're going to say that our sense of hearing just for some reason divides the auditory stimuli into 7 categories. And I'm just going to write down the C major scale as an example. It's the easiest one. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B. And those notes also happen to correspond to the A minor scale. And if you know anything about music theory, we've further divided these notes down into half steps, right? We identify the sharps and flats between them, and I'll write those in. But the thing to recognize here is that for some reason our brain just identifies with 7-note scales, and we don't know why. But let's set this aside again, and we're going to consider our olfactory senses. So the reason I put these together will come full circle, but in short, scientific research is getting closer and closer to concluding that our sense of taste is dependent on our sense of smell. But let's just focus on taste for now. So what are the ways in which we describe taste? We describe the magnitude of saltiness, okay? The magnitude of sweetness, bitterness, acidity, sourness, and lastly, savory, right? Umami. So how does smell tie into this? Well, let's just assume that the new scientific research is right, and all of these tastes are dependent on your sense of smell. So we'll put smell at the top here. Now, let's, again, set this aside, and we're going to move on to vision. So how do we describe what we see? Well, we use colors, obviously, but there's an infinite amount of colors, right? We can define any amount of colors as long as we can come up with a name for it, right? But we've still managed to divide them into primary and secondary colors, right? So let's first name the primary colors: red, yellow, and blue. And then by blending them, we come up with the secondary colors, right? Orange, green, and violet. Now, what happens when you put white light into a glass prism? Okay, it splits into the colors of the rainbow. And so, in effect, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and indigo. Now, I'm going to leave indigo out here for now. And at the end of the video, I'm going to remind you about it, and it'll make you think, but just keep it on the back of your mind. What I want you to recognize is that when you mix all these other colors together, the result is white, okay? So white breaks down into all of these other colors. So we've analyzed all these senses, and we're going to set those aside again, and we're going to come back to this original idea we had, okay? This idea that our reality is what we perceive, okay? And again, that perception is created by natural and unnatural factors. And remember, we concluded that the unnatural factors are encompassed by the way we communicate with each other, by our communication. And at this point, we're going to introduce another assumption, okay? We're going to assume that perception is a sense, okay? We're going to assume it's a sense in the same exact way those other 4 or 5 senses are, because the olfactory I combined, right? So let's look for some patterns in these other senses that might help us determine the ways in which we can describe our sense of perception. And obviously I was pointing out this recurring pattern of 7, right? And but there's 12 half steps in an octave, right? There's infinite colors. There's an infinite list of foods we can use to describe taste. But ultimately, the number of descriptions we have to describe our senses, once we break down the more complicated descriptions, they can be defined into 7 distinct magnitudes. So we are going to assume this pattern of 7 is going to show up when we attempt to describe this assumed sense of perception. So we already broke perception down into 2 categories, right? Natural and unnatural. And when we consider these unnatural factors, we determined that they were effectively dependent on our communication with each other. But remember, we had this pattern of 7, so we're trying to find 7 ways to describe perception, okay? And we found one, right? Natural. And then the unnatural, okay? But we can't really break natural down any farther, right? But we can break unnatural down, and we broke it down into communication, okay? But let's continue this process. How would we go about further breaking this down? Well, again, we're using this pattern of 7 that we've seen in these descriptions of these other senses, right? So let's look at how these descriptions all connect to each other. Let's look at how they are tied together. Now, remember, all of these descriptions of all of these senses, they have a magnitude, right? So we'll look back at physical touch. All right, we can measure a magnitude of pain or pleasure, a magnitude of softness or hardness, a magnitude of smoothness or roughness. Okay, but how about vision? All right, well, we can measure the magnitude to which red is red. And what happens when red becomes something else? Well, it becomes a different color, right? And what happens is red becomes very bright. Well, we can't look at it. We can't perceive it, right? Because it'll blind us. And likewise, as the magnitude of brightness approaches 0, we can't see it. So how about the olfactory senses, right? We can describe the magnitude of saltiness or sweetness or sourness, right? Or savory. And how about hearing? Well, we can describe the magnitude to which an A note is an A note, okay? If it's approaching B, then in between is A sharp, right? B flat. But we can also measure the magnitude to which, for example, say a song is in the key of C major. And how do we describe that? Well, we measure the magnitude to which we are in or out of key, or in or out of tune, right? But let's go back to physical touch. How exactly would softness and hardness, the magnitude of softness or hardness, how would that relate to the magnitude of smoothness or roughness? Well, to picture this, let's imagine a state, okay? Let's imagine 2 opposing states, actually. Let's imagine a state of softness approaching infinity and hardness approaching infinity. In other words, a state of hardness approaching infinity and hardness approaching 0. Those 2 opposing states of that description, right? But what happens as hardness approaches 0? Well, it approaches softness, right? But what else? What is softness? Well, softness is comfort. Softness is pleasure. So we can say that as softness approaches infinity or hardness approaches 0, pleasure approaches infinity, right? And by extension, as hardness approaches infinity and softness approaches 0, that's pain, okay? Well, how would you describe something that's really hard? Well, it's not pleasurable. It's painful. But let's consider hotness and coldness. Now, what happens as coldness approaches 0 and, in effect, hotness approaches infinity? Well, we die, right? I mean, we're only acclimated to a certain range of hotness and coldness, to a certain magnitude of that. And same with softness and hardness. If you approach a wall at 1 mile an hour, it's not very hard. But if you approach that wall at 100 miles an hour, it's going to kill you. So again, all of these play back into this pain-pleasure dichotomy. And we can say that, like, as the magnitude of any of them approaches 0 or infinity, we lose the ability to be acclimated to them. I mean, what happens when something is so sharp, right? It's painful. What happens when something's very, very dull? Well, it can't even be felt, right? It can't even provide pleasure. What about itch and a tickle? Well, what happens if something is so itchy? Well, you're going to scratch it until it starts to hurt. What happens if something is tickled so much? Well, you're going to laugh and you're going to have pleasure until it goes numb until you stop feeling the ticklish feeling, right? So how about the olfactory? What happens is something gets too salty, right? You can't tolerate it. So in effect, you stop perceiving the saltiness because you no longer want to eat that food. But what happens as saltiness approaches zero? Well, saltiness it's a huge factor in the delicious foods we create, right? So if there's no saltiness, we're probably not going to like to eat that food, unless maybe it's made up for in one of these other categories. But how about umami? Or savory? How does this tie in? Well, what is it? It's the full flavor, right? What is the full flavor? Well, the full flavor is the combination of saltiness, sweetness, sourness, acidity, and bitterness. And you know when you walk into a restaurant and you get that smell that just makes you hungry. What is the smell? That's the umami smell, right? That's the combination of all of the smells which makes you want to eat. And what about hearing? What happens when there's a song in the key of C major and all of a sudden the instruments start going out of tune? You don't want to hear it. It sounds terrible. There's no harmony. But what happens as the magnitude of an A note approaches infinity? It deafens you, right? And likewise, if the magnitude approaches zero, you can't hear it. So back to vision. What is the combination of all these colors? Where did they come from? They come from white light. So let's come back to the assumed sense of perception, okay? And we stated that our communication with each other is what determines the unnatural portion of that perception. So let's determine the state of communication approaching zero and the state of communication approaching infinity. Well, what happens when our communication increases? Well, our collective perception converges, okay? And what happens as communication decreases? Our collective perception diverges. And what is the diversion of collective perception? Well, in effect, we all become more egotistical, right? Because a higher percentage of your perception is coming from your own head, rather than that which is communicated to you or that which you communicate to somebody else. So we can say that as communication approaches zero, ego approaches infinity, egoism. So now let's consider what happens when ego goes to infinity. Well, what does that enable? Well, ego enables you to think you're better than somebody else. It enables you to think that your perception is the correct one. So what does this cause? Well, it causes an imbalance, right? It causes greed. Okay, so as ego goes up, greed goes up because you think your perception is good. So you think you have a right to the scarce resources in the environment which you both exist in. So as ego goes up, greed goes up, right? Because your perceptions are diverging. In other words, you are going to end up in confliction with the other people sharing the same resources in your environment. And by extension, you're not going to be sharing those resources. You're going to be competing for them. And as greed increases, morale decreases. Why? Because people start perceiving that the scarcity in their environment is not going to be able to provide them a desirable future. And what happens as morale decays? Well, fear increases, right? Because people look at the scarcity and they start to fear about their ability to provide. So again, what happens after people start fearing for their ability to create a future for themselves? Well, they stop having children, okay? In other words, love decreases, okay? Because people if they can't make enough money to support themselves, why the hell would they have kids? How the hell would they have kids? And what is love? Well, if love is going down, what's going up? Well, hate's going up, right? Well, what does hate lead to? Well, hate leads to anger. And what is anger? Well, anger is violence, okay? When anger approaches infinity, violence approaches infinity. So, in effect, we can say that as communication decreases, what happens? Well, hate increases, death increases, all right? It's a function of the lack of our communication. Now, Let's consider how these are all tie into each other in the same way that a C note leads to a D note. So let's say you're angry. Well, if you're angry, then it's because you have a lot of hate. Your perception is filled with hate. And if your perception is filled with hate, you have a lot of fear. Okay, but say you're fearful, you're a fearful person, or your fear is increasing. Well, you might blame that fear on the greed, right? You might blame it on the fact that the resources are becoming more scarce. But before you can do that, your morale had to decrease. So again, what's the pattern here? Did you notice there's 7 factors here, okay? And if we try to make another one after anger, I mean, again, the anger is the violence. The anger is the death of whatever species is we're talking about here. So in conclusion, these 6 factors, okay, these 6 descriptions of our sense of perception are a function of our magnitude of communication. So let's tie this in to what is going on in the United States and elsewhere in the world right now. Well, let's look at ego. How would ego be increasing? What are some signs that ego would be increasing? Well, we're taking selfies, right? We have this social media. We're posting pictures of ourselves all over the place. What else are we doing? Well, we are getting plastic surgery. Okay, we're taking steroids to build, frankly, ridiculous amounts of muscle. What else? Obesity acceptance movements. Okay, but let's move to greed. How is greed increasing? What are the signs of that? Well, obviously increasing wealth inequality, which we have measured. Okay, but what's our solution to that? Well, our solution is stimulus bills that, for some reason, are causing an overcorrection in inflation. So how about morale? What are some signs that morale is decreasing? Well, depression. That is a state of low morale, is it not? So we're treating this depression with these anti-depression medications, right? So on to fear. Okay, how's fear increasing? Well, the media. Look at the media. They're dividing everybody. That these opposing groups are becoming more and more fearful of each other as time goes on. What else? How are we treating the fear? Anti-anxiety meds, right? So how about love? What are some signs that love is decaying? Well, people are having less children. People are having less sex. People are increasingly lonely. And how are we treating the loneliness? With dating apps, porn, prostitution. Our very sexual identity is being perverted. There's homosexuality, there's gender dysphoria, there's pedophilia. Now, I have no problem with those first 2 things, but the pattern is that we are losing our reproductive capacity because we are in a state of decay. Now, anger. What are some signs that anger is on the rise? Well, life expectancy is decreasing, obviously, right? And in addition to that, we have this war that looks like it's threatening a world war, right? So again, all of these things, this vicious cycle of ego, greed, morale, fear, love, and anger, it's all a function of our communication. It's all a function of our perception. So let me ask, who do you think is in control of our perception, or of the portion that we control, the unnatural factors? Well, increasingly, we are using our own technology to communicate. So we're going to make another assumption here. We're going to assume that communication is approaching zero, and we're going to say that technology is the culprit, okay? Now, this is the stage at which everything kind of clears up, okay? This is the stage at which I'm going to present you with evidence, and that evidence is going to unlock your ability to search the cosmos for other patterns. So let's look at the predominant controllers of perception in the past. Who were they? They were religion, right? The giant religions, the main ones, okay? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, okay, among others. And what I need you to do is I need you to remove any perceptions you have about what the purpose of these religions were. Now, I'm going to ask you to make another assumption. I'm going to make you assume that these religions were all worshiping the same thing. Okay, as I said in the beginning of the video, make that assumption and let's see where it leads us. What is a pattern that we can recognize in all of these religions? Well, 7 was a holy number in all of these religions, or at the very least, it showed up in lists. There's these lists of 7 everywhere in all of these religions. So I'm gonna look at one of these lists. Look at the 7 deadly sins, and you're gonna have to make an assumption again. We're going to assume that these lists coincide with these senses of perception. Okay, with ego, greed, morale, fear, love, and anger. And then we'll consider how the mother of those vicious cycles, the communication itself, is communicated to us. Now, why would I say that these lists coincide with those senses of perception? Well, if the point of the religion is to control perception, then the medium by which it does that is the scripture, especially in the long term. So if they were trying to preserve the fact that our perception is a function of our communication, is a function of the magnitude to which we communicate with each other, how would they do it? They would write it down. They'd write it down over and over again. But what happens? As the communication decays over time, the message gets perverted, right? So all of a sudden, what was supposed to be defined as perception turns into some deity. Why? Because, well, the lack of communication thrust us into the vicious cycle of ego, greed, decreasing morale, fear, hate, and anger. And what does that vicious cycle lead to? Well, it leads to people trying to find the reason for all of the imbalance, the reason for all of the problems. And oftentimes people become a little confused and they say, well, the only answer is that there's some God orchestrating all of it who's a greater deity. Or they just write the world off as an evil place, as a hostile place. I did this for years. But what they didn't realize is that the God was themselves all along. They just needed to take control of their communication, and this cycle wouldn't start. So let's look at the 7 deadly sins to start. Okay, we have lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. Now let's try to compare these, or rather even categorize them into our senses of perception that we've defined. So lust is what? It's infatuation. It's the perversion of love. All right. What is gluttony? Well, gluttony is, it could be considered a result of low morale, or it can be considered a result of greed, right? And today we have these again, obesity acceptance movements that are perverting this sin per se. Okay. So how about greed? Well, greed, we identified that one already. That one's obvious. Sloth, well, again, what is a sloth? Lazy. So what does a lazy person do? Well, they have low morale, right? Because they don't care about their future. So now how about wrath? Wrath's obviously anger, and envy and pride are both opposed to each other, but they both represent ego, right? Now, why didn't they exhaust my list? Why are not all of these 6 senses of perception accounted for? Well, again, these scriptures are very old, right? They've been translated who knows how many times, and the original message just disappears. I mean, even in the languages we have today, some languages just don't have the words to represent what other languages can. And the truth is the English language is actually pretty good at that. It's pretty good at explaining things. Now, I'm not going to look at another list of 7. I'm going to leave that to you, because if I spoil all this for you, it's not as fun. But what other ways would they try to communicate this message through time other than direct words in Scripture? Well, they would use symbols, right? And what's the difference between symbols and Scripture? Well, symbols, they hold through time better. They hold up through time a lot better, right? Because they're not dependent on a language that changes over time. So what would be some symbols that represent these 6 senses of perception. Well, the Star of David is a 6-pointed star, right? It's two interlaced triangles. And each point has a direct path to each other, just like ego, greed, morale, fear, love, and anger all affect each other. So how about the heptagram in Christianity? It's said to represent those 7 days of creation. All right, they didn't make it 10. There's a reason they didn't make it a 10-sided star. Now, since the Star of David was around before Christianity, am I saying that Judaism is the one true religion? Well, this is where things get really interesting. So let's assume that Judaism isn't the original religion. Let's assume instead that it's just another one that figured it out, that unlocked this path. What are some symbols before the rise of even Judaism that might help hint at this model of our perception? So let's look at the pyramids. Right? Let's look at the Egyptian pyramids. What are they made out of? They're made out of limestone, okay? Now, where are these pyramids located? Well, they're located in a hot desert, right? What happens when you heat limestone? Well, that's how we make glass. Okay, so let's imagine that this glass pyramid is symbolic for a glass prism. What happens when you shine white light into a glass prism? It splits into the colors of the rainbow, okay? It splits into 7 colors. So not only does that number 7 pop up again, but we can make a connection between the symbolic connection between the sense of perception and the sense of vision here. Let's, instead of looking closer at the pyramids of Giza for symbols of these senses of perception, let's zoom out. Okay, look at this picture. Now, if you know anything about computers, you would know that this resembles a microchip. Now, is that a coincidence? Well, how about let's look at these other pyramids. These are in China. Does that look like a microchip as well? Okay, well, let's look for some more symbolism. Let's go back to these the pyramids of Giza. So right in the middle of the map, you see the part labeled number 4. That's called the Tomb of Khafre. Do you see that shape? Does that look like a camera to you? What would that represent? Well, it'd represent ego, right? The ego is the first thing to be corrupted after the communication's corrupted, and it happens to be in the middle of the map. And do you know what they found in the Tomb of Khafre? They found the bones of a bull. Now, what could that represent? Perhaps the death of a bull market? Okay, but what else? What is this Sphinx? It's a mix between a human and a man. And what's the running joke of the internet? The internet worships cats. So why is this significant? Well, what's the first thing that happens when your communication gets perverted? Well, ego gets corrupted. Now, what does that insinuate about our entire perception of the way we view history? Well, what do we think? What is our theory of the pyramids? We think the pyramids were worshipping a pharaoh. We think the pyramids were worshipping a god. But what if that's not the case? What if the pyramids were a monument to these senses of perception, and the pharaoh was just the one that brought back that perception to humanity? And the pharaoh wasn't the god; he was just a prophet. Okay, if that, they may not have worshipped anyone in particular. But why is this significant? Well, think about how long it took us to go from living in log cabins to the technology we have now. It happened in a span of a mere 400 years. So in other words, our ego has kept us thinking that these pyramids were the remains of a primitive civilization, and yet we can't figure out how the hell they built these massive pyramids. So what actually happened is that they had the technology we have now, if not well beyond it. Why? Because they understood these senses of perception, and they understood if they were not controlled, they would destroy humanity, and they understood it so well that they made a playground of symbols to stand for all time so that humanity could figure out why they are decaying. And I decoded it. So in essence, I might literally be the second coming of Jesus, but not really, right? Because we have all these religions that found this truth. So how many religions found this truth? Well, who knows? Who knows? There's so many lost religions we know nothing about. They were all worshiping the same exact thing. And if you're not convinced yet, I want you to, again, assume I am right and go and look at history and see how everything adds up. Everything makes perfect sense. So look back at these problems that we're seeing in our society and the solutions we came up with for them. What's in common with all these solutions? Well, they're just treatment, right? They're not solutions. The solution is to fix the communication, but we're not doing that. We're just treating them. Why are we treating them? Because capitalism has bound us to short-term profit, okay? And if you want to see the economic side of this explained, the economic, particularly in reference to inflation and the overcorrection of inflation that is occurring right now, watch my first video. It's titled Inflation in Capitalistic Markets. What's the date today? The day this video was released, it is March 14th, 2023. Okay, I did not plan that. That happened by chance, okay? I made this discovery about 24 to 36 hours ago. I had almost no sleep, and then I woke up today and made this video. Now, I made this video with such haste because I understand the importance of the message, and that haste happened to land on March 14th. It's almost comical, isn't it? It's like it all just came together at one time. It's what reality is meant to be. There's just this ebb and flow, this rise and fall. But you know what? It's possible that the civilization that built these pyramids is the remnants of a civilization that nuked themselves, and they thought it through, and they figured out what the hell the problem was, and they left a warning for future civilization. Alternative theory, there are floods in many scriptures, okay? Well, what if the technology is what caused a massive spike in temperature and therefore a flood? And that flood, that story of that great flood just worked its way through the different religions, and it was passed down year after year. And again, it gets perverted. The ego gets perverted, and then we lose the ability to see all this. Everything makes sense. I sure hope I can get this message across to you. What's important is that you send it to other people. Maybe somebody doesn't quite understand the scope of this video. Maybe you have to help them understand. I can't do this alone. It requires more than me. But if I can communicate it to even one person, we can reverse this vicious cycle of these perverted senses of perception, and we can reach the stars. Why? Because our only enemy left at that point is the natural environment. And guess what? What did the Giza pyramids point at? They point at Orion's belt. They point at the stars. All of these patterns, they're not a coincidence. This is reality, okay? And I welcome you to this new perception of reality. I welcome you, friend. Join me. Let us restore our communication and become our own gods, okay? Now, this doesn't mean we can't move forward with these microchips. What it means is that we have to be conscious of how they're affecting us, okay? All these wars in the past century, you have to understand they've enabled us. They've enabled us to produce this technology, and now I've enabled us to use it for good instead of evil. But I can't do it alone. That's the thing. The only way it comes full circle is if you join me. I'll point out another coincidence. The username of this channel is Limit is Illusion. I happened to pick that up at least 10 years ago. And I actually got that from Michael Jordan. I think he said something like, limit like fear is often an illusion. And the reason that's significant is because what is implied? It implies that limit is an illusion. It implies that if we control our perception, the limit is the stars, right? The limit is the environment. The limit is, in effect, the universe, okay? And what man would have known that better than the greatest basketball player of all time? It's possible that one of these, the civilization that built the Giza pyramids, it's possible they already left. I mean, they might have made generational ships, or they might have just discovered something that we can't even fathom of yet. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an astrophysicist, but I have a feeling that this is going to enable us to make some great discoveries. But again, what happened? They might have left this planet, and then what happened? The communication fell again. Okay, so say they did leave the planet in 3000 BC when the pyramids were built. What happens after that? Well, maybe they took all that technology and they got rid of it, and they allowed another civilization to build, and they left these symbols all over the planet so that we could rebuild this sense of perception. Why? Because the written language is not going to stand the test of time. My own words, okay? This very understanding which I'm communicating to you now will, in all likelihood, decay again, and it will rise again. It's an ebb and flow. You look into these patterns, and you'll just be enlightened endlessly. If you search enlightenment in this universe, you will find it. If you search for these patterns, and it's truly incredible. I implore you to follow your free will, and the extent to which we control our perception is the extent to which we control our free will. And to talk about me a little, I need to say that I'm not special, okay? Not only am I special, but I've never done anything significant in my life until this moment. And I've never had a purpose until this moment. I've been a depressed, lazy piece of shit, and and it changes today. There's just so much more, and I couldn't see it. And I feel like a lot of people feel what I'm communicating. They felt it, and it's kept them up, right? But they were never able to communicate it. And the strangest thing is, man, I'm a social recluse. I don't know how to communicate with anybody. And this fell on me. It's just so strange, isn't it? But I have to tell you, just spread the message, okay? I can't do it alone. I can't. The way I communicate to people probably isn't going to be able to reach everybody. You're going to have to communicate with people face to face. And at this point, I want to bring back that idea, that color indigo we skipped over earlier. I want to ask you, and I want you to leave a comment, why do you think we perceive that color indigo? Okay, and lastly, I would like you to go back to the description and click on that poll number 2, and I'd like you to re-answer that question. And just a fair warning, if you manage to take in the content of this video, you're going to be so intrigued for the next 24 hours, you're not going to be able to sleep. You're going to be buried in research. There's just so many patterns. This isn't a good day. This is a great day.
You don't think this is an obvious suicide, Mr. Pet Detective?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Lord knows there's plenty of evidence here to support your theory. Except, of course, for that spot of blood on the railing over there. May I tell you what I think happened? Alrighty then. Roger Podacter went out after work. He had a few drinks and he came home. But he wasn't alone. Someone else was with him in this apartment. There was a struggle, and he was thrown over that balcony. Roger Podacter didn't commit suicide. He was murdered.
Well, that's a very entertaining story, but unfortunately, real detectives have to worry about that little thing called evidence.
Uh-oh. I think I heard a toilet flush. Maybe somebody lost a turtle.
Well, I guess I'm a little out of my league here. Einhorn, good work. Oh, there is just one more thing, Lieutenant. This woman is Roger Podacter's neighbor. She lives across the hall. She said she heard a scream. Is that right, ma'am?
Right.
And you said you had to open the balcony door when you keyed into the room?
Yeah, that's true.
You're certain you had to open this door?
Yeah, I'm certain.
What's the point, Ventura?
Only this. This is double pane soundproof glass. There's no way that neighbor could have heard Podacter scream on the way down with that door shut. The scream she heard came from inside this apartment before he was thrown over the balcony, and the murderer closed the door before he left. Yes! Yes! Oh, yeah! Can you feel that, buddy? Huh? 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 I have exorcised the demons. This house is clear. Losers? Get him out of here! Losers!
Let's go, Ace.
Losers. Losers.
Come on, Ace. Back to the zoo.